On behalf of the whole CEN team, welcome everyone. Really excited to see everyone here today. Thank you for joining us for our third annual Network Conference. Each year this conference has grown year over year, only our third year, but every year we've seen very considerate growth. I think you'll agree as the day progresses that we've really raised the bar again this year. And we're excited. Last year we had about 350 registered participants. This year, as of last evening, we had over 440 registered attendees. So, big round of applause to you guys, and thanks for your support. This year, we have not one, but two excellent keynote speakers. In just a few minutes, I'll introduce our first for our morning session. I know this afternoon, or throughout the day, we have so many great sessions that it's going to be a challenge to choose which one you want to attend. I was struggling with that myself as I was looking at the agenda and trying to figure out where I'm going to spend my time. Before I get into all the exciting stuff, let me just take a few minutes to cover some of the logistics. I think you probably already know bathrooms are at the ends of the conference convention center, and if you haven't yet already, please download our mobile app. It'll help. There's a map on there. It'll tell you all the information about the speakers, the sessions, and it'll also prompt you to take a short survey at the end of each session. That feedback is critical for us and the programming committee as we look at how to lay out our conference for next year. One other note of logistics is in the badge holder that we gave out, please note that there's a drink ticket there. Don't throw it away. You're going to need that for the reception this afternoon. And there's also a parking pass, so if you parked here in the garage, please keep that pass for when you exit. If there's anything that comes up throughout the day today, please don't hesitate to stop by our reception desk, or registration desk rather. And thanks again for coming. I want to take a minute to just thank our program committee for helping, for all their hard work and participation in helping shape this year's conference. Again, I think the group has done a phenomenal job. We're already taking volunteers for next year if anybody's interested. I also want to take a minute to thank the CEN staff for their dedication and hard work. We're a really small, lean team, and it takes a lot of work to balance this with all of our other duties of keeping the network running, and really appreciate their hard work. I also need to take just a minute to thank our sponsors. A huge thank you to all of our sponsors here this year. This event would not be possible without their support. Our platinum sponsors this year, Juniper and Integration Partners, they're also hosting our reception at the end of the evening, so drinks are on the menu. Also thank you to our gold sponsors, Digital Back Office, C+, NetApp, NWN, Palo Alto Networks, TBNG Consulting, and two of our silver sponsors, Extreme Network, who made our breakfast possible this morning, and IGX Global, who's sponsoring our lunch. So when you get a moment, please take a chance to interact with some of the sponsors and let them know how much you appreciate their support for our event. Without them, it's truly not possible. So CEN, most of you have a relationship with us and know who we are, but we're committed to providing a robust, state-of-the-art research and education network and network services for our members. To deliver on this commitment, we strive to remove the barriers to access and technology, broadband technology. This past year, our team has accomplished some really great things. And I'm just going to take a minute to go over a couple of the key points from this past year. As of February, we were connected to internet to 100 gig here in Hartford. This is our primary connection in support of all external connectivity, and enables really high-speed access to research outside of Connecticut. This is a really key development for us, and it took about 18 months to actually see it to fruition. As of today, we're already utilizing about 20% of that connection. So it's pretty impressive. Another major accomplishment, midway through our school year this year, we swapped out our web filtering system and upgraded to the iBoss Secure Web Gateway. We've been very pleased with the feedback that we've gotten, but please keep it coming. And we want to shape our services to best meet your needs. So the more feedback we get, the better. We feel that it's been a really highly successful upgrade. I hope all of you share that. As of this week, we have 43 towns now connected to the network, and over another 50 that are in the process of connecting. Some of the great successes we've heard from the towns range from cost savings to realization, regionalization, and sharing of services between the tenants. We're excited to work with these and welcome them to our community. This past year, we've redoubled our efforts around communication and outreach. I hope you've noticed some of our newsletters. Maybe that's even how you found out about this event. We also have been hosting a variety of other outreach events with help from our members and our community and our partners. We have hosted an IPv6 roundtable, BGP workshops, a 3D printing workshop. The first 3D printing workshop, we got way more demand than we ever thought. That was hosted with Darien Library. So because we got so much demand and had to turn so many people away, we reached back out to our community and asked that Coventry Library come and help and host a second, not one, but they've got a 1 day where they're hosting 2 sessions back to back. I think there's still a couple slots open for the afternoon session, so if that's of interest, please pass on the word or sign up. These can be found on our website or in our newsletters. We've also added connectivity to key locations. We're now built into multiple data centers around the state, the most recent one being in Norwalk. Between your connection with CEN and these facilities, we have the ability to build a private circuit right into these sites or into any of the sites between 2 member sites, meaning we can make these sites look like they're part of your network, like they're in your buildings. These unique aspects of the network, hopefully we can work together to figure out new ways to enable benefits and realize benefits from these. Finally, we have the ability to build these same type of private connections into the cloud. Providers like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and bring those services directly into your network. This past year, we've seen our largest increase in network usage ever. In our 15 years, this year beat all the others. Before last year, a typical year, we would have seen about 40% traffic growth year over year. This year, we saw a 66% increase in traffic from the previous year. Last year, at this time, I stood up here and talked about how we were doing on average 22.5 gig per second. Today, we're at 37.5 gig per second. The CEN network and architecture allows us to continue to scale to meet these demands and the unique demands that research and education community have. In the next year, we will continue to work on making some important investments to make sure that we continue to deliver on these commitments that we have without having any contention in the network. We will be working to build additional 100 gig circuits in our backbone, upgrading member sites as you all use more bandwidth. And we will be working to build connectivity to New York City so that we can directly peer with some of our significant traffic exchange peers. For example, did you know that we are transferring on a daily basis between 11 and 12 gig per second all day long with Google? That's just amazing to me. I don't want to go on too long, but I this time, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Mark Raymond, our state CIO, to the stage to welcome you all and provide a few remarks.
Thank you all for joining us this morning, and thank you for being a part of this network family. My name is Mark Raymond. I'm the Chief Information Officer for the state of Connecticut, and I'm also the Chair for the Connecticut Commission on Education Technology. In that role, the CET is the governing body over the Connecticut Education Network. So I have a dual responsibility in sort of operating the network from an administrative perspective along with the University of Connecticut, but also providing some of the oversight and governance for the overall network. I'm going to be very brief this morning. CEN is really a truly unique capability. It's a statewide fiber optic network that runs to every city and every town in our great state. If technology continues to be the future for our citizens and our economy, which I truly believe that it is, then this network is really the connective tissue between us and the rest of the world. High-speed networks expand our reach and allow us to get the most from our limited resources. And if you follow the newspaper, the state has limited resources, believe it or not. They bring content into our schools. It allows us to connect student to student, student to teacher, school to school, library to library, town to town, and country to country. My family hosted a Chinese exchange student this past school year. In order to prepare, my daughter was one of the users of the Connecticut Education Network. They did video conferencing from their school to China to help connect with their students before they came in and sort of ease that relationship before they even showed up in the country. My younger daughter actually utilized the network in our local library where she was able to loan a book from another library when our town didn't have the specialty resource of all things on the Pequot War. So there's not a lot of literature out there, but she was able to find something very unique. So our schools were able to implement another year of smarter balance testing without the technical challenges that are seen elsewhere around the country, all due to the sort of technical underpinnings of the network. So sometimes we tend to overlook the benefits of the technology when everything works like we hope that it would. If the budget remains intact, over the next year we'll finally be able to connect some of our remaining libraries to the fiber optic network. So we're very much looking forward to upgrading their service and the important work that they do in our communities. So I'd like to thank Wendy, Scott, Brandon, Mike, Mark, and the entire CEN team for working tirelessly on your behalf. They always attempt to stay 2 steps ahead of what our needs are, and when we're growing at 66% a year, that's really difficult to do. But being able to provide you the bandwidth for when you need it. And I'll leave you with one final thought today. You're really a key part of this network. It's not just about the bandwidth and the technology drops, but it's the value that you receive in your environments, in your schools, in your libraries, in your towns. And that value is really only limited by your imagination. The network can do amazing things. The capability we have, it will prepare you to meet with whatever you can imagine. So I'd ask you to bring your challenges and your successes and share them with our team, and with your fellow members. In that way, we can tell the really wonderful story about how CEN is really bringing value across the entire state. So thank you for your part in being a critical part of this endeavor. It wouldn't be this way without your support, without your imagination, and we thank you very much for joining us here today. So I'll turn it back to Scott.
Thank you, Mark. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote morning speaker, Matt Watts. Matt has over 2 decades of IT experience and has spent the last decade with NetApp. His current role as Director of Technology and Strategy allows him what I consider really fun job of attending events such as this one and articulating the business value of IT. So without further ado, please give Matt Watts a warm welcome to our stage.
Thanks very much. So I need to start off with an apology. This is not how I normally dress to deliver a keynote. But American Airlines didn't manage to get my bag here. I guess it could have been worse. They could have got my bag here and not me, which would have meant this was a very long keynote. You just staring at a suitcase for an hour. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the privilege of being able to talk to you for a period of time. As we were just saying, there are two things in this world that I love to do. One is to talk, the other one is to travel. And I find myself in a very fortunate position that I get paid to do both. And what that means is that you get some incredible experiences. My role is I cover Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I didn't always do that. I started off as a UK employee for NetApp, and then somebody came to me and they said, would you like to take on a Europe, Middle East, and Africa role? And I jumped at the chance because I was thinking, Paris, Milan. My first trips were to Ethiopia, to Zimbabwe, to Moscow. And I don't know how many of you have ever had the opportunity to go to Zimbabwe. It's a fascinating country, full of people who have a real desire to try and better themselves, to do something, constantly being knocked back, but constantly having that passion and that drive to want to do something new. I flew down to Zimbabwe the very first time I went, and all I knew about Zimbabwe was what I knew from the news, which you guys know how the country's publicised. So I was a little nervous when I was first going, and the guy said to me, when you get to the airport, they gave me a code word, and they said, this is the code you exchange with the driver. Don't just pick any driver, because you don't know what will happen to you. So I got to the country, and I'm now feeling quite nervous. I met my driver, I jumped in the car with my driver, and he said, oh, can you take your watch off? And just kind of eyed it out the way. Okay, he said, in your bag, he said, can you put your bag well underneath the seat so it's not seen by anyone? And then he said the best thing, he said, and try not to look too conspicuous. Really? But we went to, we had a meeting with one of the local telecoms companies. And we arrived at their office and we were kind of greeted, and they took us up to the main boardroom. And we sat down and we were kind of waiting for things to start. And the reason I love this is because it's that moment of, when do we make a decision to do something differently? What is it that causes us to make a decision to do something new or to do something we need to do? And we arrived in this meeting where we sat down and we waited for the customer, the CIO, to come and join us. And after about 5 minutes, there was this massive explosion from outside of the room that we were in. And I kind of looked around because I was jittery anyway. And no one moved. No one batted an eyelid. Apparently this was quite normal. In fact, one of my colleagues pointed to the window and he said, hey, look, the mushroom cloud. There's this huge cloud of dust went up in the background. And no one moved. And then a few minutes later, the CIO and his team came in and they sat down with us. And we were chatting and I said to them, there's a lot of stuff we could talk about. I said, well, where do you want to start? And he said, I think we need to cover disaster recovery. I said, fantastic. That was that defining moment. Now, it turns out it was a little bit more innocent than I realised because they were actually decommissioning bedrock. They were putting a new road in into the motorway. But then as I thought about that, this is even better because these explosions have been clearly going on for days now. And where was the point where it got close to their one and only data centre? The guy suddenly said, you should probably do something about a disaster recovery strategy. And I love that because everybody's reason to do something is different, and theirs was very much driven by a need to make sure they could deliver services with these kind of extreme environments going on. So the things I want to talk about today is going to be change. I want to share a few stories with you. I hope that you enjoy the way that I tell them because I think it's often more interesting if you hear stories than it is for me just to stand up here and deliver a bunch of facts to you. This is my mum, and the reason I put my mother up at the beginning of this presentation was that for her 69th birthday she retired. Now, my mother and father met when they were sort of in their 20s. And if you think about this, there was no technology. This is one generation behind us, one generation removed from us. And they came through the education system and there was no technology. It wasn't like they had a choice of, could they get into computers. When they were in the building trade for 20, 30 years, when they got to the end of that and thought that was a young man's game, they then moved to a little seaside town, where I still live. And they ran a shell shop, a little shop selling trinkets and shells and all sorts of little gifts, a little kind of curiosity shop. And they did that for about another 3 or 4 years, until they finally made the decision that they had to actually retire properly. Now, I knew what was going to happen. The thing is that I didn't know how long it would take. And my mother came around for dinner one evening when we were chatting, and she just turned to me and she said, "I'm bored." And well, I'm not quite sure what I can do about that, but I'll carry on. And she said, "I've seen this interweb thing." It's the internet, Mum. And at that moment, I made the decision that I would buy my mother her first computer at the age of 69. And I will give you all the warning that there was no one there to give me at the time. And if you choose to introduce somebody to technology at the age of 69, you better be prepared for everything that comes along with that. You will be the support desk, you will get the most random questions. But I will tell you this for a love of it, and a love of her, persevere, because after 6 months of buying her first computer and going through some of these pains, again, we had dinner one evening and she said, we couldn't sell the stock when we closed the shop. I said, yeah. And she said, well, I set up an eBay account, a PayPal account. And she said, I now have an online shop and I'm selling all of the stock online. 6 months after we buying her first computer, she's now trading online. She has a little online shop. For her 70th birthday, I said to her, what would you like for your birthday this year? And she said, this year I want an iPod. She said, because I'm fed up with all the CDs lying around the house, and I much prefer to have the music collection online. Now, it turns out, when my parents retired, they loved to have dinner together in the evenings. And they live in this little town, they're up on the hill, they look out over the bay in Westland. And the reason she wanted an iPod wasn't because of the iPod. The reason she wanted an iPod is that every evening, she sits there with my father, and they have dinner, and they have a glass of wine, and they listen to music. And my mum realised that if she had an iPod, it wouldn't be the same music every time, it could just be put on shuffle. And every evening, they sat there with a glass of wine, having their meal, be a different evening. It wasn't the technology that particularly mattered to her. It was what would that enable her to do? Why would that make her life better or different in some kind of way? For her 71st birthday, by the way, she'll be 73, this doesn't want too long. For her 89th birthday, thank you very much. So for her 71st birthday, again I said to her, looking at this year and this year, that year she wanted a Kindle. So I bought her a Kindle and she got rid of all the books that she had. This is a woman in her 70s who never used technology. She doesn't own a CD, she doesn't own a movie, she doesn't own a book. But she owns the technologies to be able to do it. And then finally for her 72nd birthday, I said, what do you want this year? And she said, this year I want a scanner. Okay, why would you want a scanner? It turns out she wanted to scan all of the family photographs so that we could share it with people. So we're quite dispersed as a family, we live all over the world. And she wanted to share photographs with the family, which I thought, what a lovely thing to do. And then she discovered Facebook and has befriended me and many of my friends. And randomly posts images of, about age 3 in the bath. So every few mornings I get to enjoy something which I hope even my wife hasn't seen and the whole world gets to enjoy as well. So I think when it comes to change, and I'm a technologist, that's my background, I'm a tech guy. And I look at change and it is difficult, we get very fixated on technology, we like technology, and the world we're living in is changing at a pace that I don't think I've ever seen before. I'm 43 now, and I think I've kept up fairly well, and I don't think it's me, I don't think it's that I've slowed down, I think it is simply that the pace of change around me is quickening. And that makes me kind of very focused on, so how do you help people, how do you encourage people to change in a world that's moving so quickly? Because a lot of people don't like to change. And I think that was what came from my mum, that's what I learned from my mum. It was nothing to do with the technology. It was simply about, she could see that her evenings would be so much better because of technology that she convinced herself to change. And I think that, for me, is something that I've learned and I've taken through my life, is that if you can show somebody where they could be is so much better than where they are, they will change. Even the most hardened people who are attached to technology, attached attached to something, if you can show them that where they could be is so much better, they will change. So let me give you a little perspective. Let me bring this a little bit kind of closer to home. If I look at the kind of IT in general, if I look within IT, and lucky enough to meet with IT people all over the world, when you kind of break down what IT does, if I was to put my mind into that of a CIO, what I constantly hear is they view IT as these three things: run, grow, and transform. Run is that there is a whole bunch of stuff that IT has to do. There are applications that are very important to our businesses, to our schools, to our establishments, but don't necessarily have the potential to add a lot of value. But they are important, we have to keep doing. Then there's grow, which is there is a bunch of things that we probably do today that if we could do them better, if we could put more time, more effort, more investment into them, the chances are they can make a difference. And then there's transform. And transform is the one that absolutely fascinates me, and it's the one that gets me up every morning. It's the things that we could do. What is the art of the possible? How many people in the room use Twitter? That's not a bad showing. So for those of you who do use Twitter, and the reason I mention this is because there's usually two camps. There are the people who do use Twitter, and if you're like, so I am a reluctant Twitter user, which meant that I tried it, couldn't see the value in it, so stopped using it, and then my marketing team told me I had to, so I kind of moved back in and I'm using it again, and now that I've started to really use it, I've started to see the value of it. In fact, just yesterday, I tweeted last night that my luggage hadn't made it here, and I turned up here this morning and there were 5 polo shirts waiting for me. They've been brought in by various different people around the room, which is just an amazing thing, because of Twitter. So the second camp is the people who dismiss it. That's the camp that worries me. I am okay with people making a technology choice or a technology decision. Fine, if you look at Twitter and it doesn't suit your lifestyle, it doesn't work for you and your environment, then that's fine. I have no problem with that. What worries me is quite often there's an association that comes with that as well, which is I don't use Twitter and it's all a bunch of rubbish. That worries me, because these kind of technologies have massive potential. I don't know how many of you have ever come across something called the Twitter Firehose. Some of you have probably heard about this. If you wanted to, you could subscribe to the Twitter Firehose, and by the end of today, you will have received 600 million tweets, because they will send you every single tweet that gets posted every single second, every single day by every single Twitter user. It's about 500 or 600 million. So I come back to my 2 camps. There's a camp who would look at that and say, that is 600 million more tweets than I could ever possibly want to have access to. But then look at it this way. If you create 600 million of anything, there is value in there somewhere. It's a question of how do I find it, how do I extract it, how do I actually look into this, how do I use this vast amount of information to give me some insight that I didn't have before. We're starting to see sentiment analysis now. You can go to service providers and ask them how you are perceived. And they'll use these feeds as ways of finding out how you're perceived in the market by your customers, or how you're perceived and your products are perceived, how your establishments are perceived. It's all in there. We had a company in London a little while ago, trading companies, and we spotted that they were physically moving offices around the city of London. And we didn't know why this was happening. We asked some of our teams to go out and talk to them. And it turns out they were trying to get closer to the point of presence on the network, on the internet. Because by being closer to the point of presence, it would shave 1/4 of a millisecond of a transaction. And 1/4 of a millisecond was the difference between making money and losing money. That's how aggressive, that's how tight the kind of technologies are, and how incredibly narrow those kind of margins are for making money and losing money in those kind of sectors. Those companies are using sentiment analysis. They're using Twitter, they're using these kind of feeds in order to learn. There's a company in the UK called HMV. It's Master's Voice, a very traditional music company. HMV struggled to adapt to the new world. They struggled to work out how do we kind of go from selling people products, selling people CDs and DVDs, to this more online type experience. And they never made it. And for several years, HMV have kind of gone through this death rattle, where they were kind of going to survive, not going to survive. HMV were a publicly listed company with an awful lot of investors into it. A lot of trading companies had a lot of exposure to HMV. When HMV finally went into that kind of administration, And they sent the administrators in, who were older guys, very well-educated, very well-knowledge guys. They went into the company to make some decisions about how do we do something to reduce costs, to turn the fortunes of this company around. And the very first decision they made was that they were going to sack the entire marketing organization. Which I think is unfortunate, because actually that's, for me, is a route back to success, not a way of reducing costs. So they called the marketing team together. They brought them all in and said, we're very sorry, you know the situation the company's in. We've got to make some changes, we've got to reduce costs. And unfortunately, it means we have to lay all of you off. And meanwhile, the entire marketing team was sat in that room on the company Twitter account, tweeting the company must be buggered, we've all just been fired. Now, that went out on Twitter. If I have a major investment into HMV stock, that is a signal that I want to know. And if I can pick up that signal an hour, 2 hours, a day before my competitors, not only can I trade out a position, I can trade out without anyone knowing I'm doing it. And we're now starting to see this go much, much broader. The use of tools like Twitter, those kind of things, those feeds, are driving the need for whole new types of infrastructures. And it's not a infrastructure challenge as such. We can build these new tools and do MongoDB, Waterworks, Cloudera. All of these new applications are coming about because we have the ability to access streams of information at a quantity we have simply never, ever had to deal with before. And they create and have the potential to create massive value. So if I look into the education spend, and we kind of say that stuff in run has the least opportunity to create value, but it's it's very important. Grow and transform as you move across have that incredible ability to create value. How do we invest our money? According to Gartner, this is how we spend money. 75% roughly of the IT budget goes into the things that, whilst very important, I can keep stressing that, whilst being very important, have the least opportunity to do something differently, the least opportunity to create value. And it's driven us to every meeting I have, number 1 or number 2 on the list is cost reduction. With every customer meeting, with every CIO meeting I have, it's number 1 or number 2 on this list. And it's driven a lot by this. You see a big number, and you naturally therefore want to reduce it so that you can effectively move the money. You can start realigning where the IT budget spent. For at least the last 6 or 7 years of my life, I've been listening to this reduced cost, reduced cost, reduced cost. And I've seen some incredible things happen inside organizations. The IT teams will move underneath the CFO in certain organizations as a way of controlling costs. We saw procurement teams being set up to drive costs down. We've seen, I met with a company the other week, and the IT department worked for human resources. God, can you imagine what that would be like? But all of these things, this kind of fanatical motivation on how do we drive change, how do we drive costs down. This is the latest numbers that Gartner published. But if I took you back to 2008, how different do you think the numbers would be? Bearing in mind the massive cost reduction exercises we've done. They're exactly the same. We fundamentally have not changed things. And I think the reason is that we're seeing more and more and more come in to transform. And nothing ever goes away. And the challenge, one of the challenges that we have within IT is how do we cope with the fact that we are constantly being asked to do new things, and we struggle to ever get rid of anything that we're currently doing. And a wonderful example, if I look inside NetApp, we use email. I think email will be, I've got 20 more years for retirement. I don't think email will have gone away by the time I retire. But do your children use it? Probably not. But if I look at NetApp, we use email. And then somebody came along, because we're also a Salesforce customer, and somebody came along, because inside Salesforce there's a feature called Chatter, which is like corporate Twitter. And somebody went, Chatter? There's a good tool, we should use that. So now we use email and Chatter. And then somebody came along, because we're a Cisco company, and they said, Jabber? There's a good tool, we should use that. So now we use email and Chatter and Jabber. And then most recently, Yammer came along. That's a good tool. So now we use email and Chatter and Jabber and Yammer, which are 4 tools to talk to each other. And nothing went away. And that's on top of the stuff. I mean, we're all using iPhones and we're all using WhatsApp and Snapchat. There's all these other things coming through as well. You have to keep reducing costs. Because everything comes in to transform and make a difference. But over time, it becomes a utility or a commodity. Everything over time becomes a utility or a commodity. commodity, which means it's moving across to something that we just have to run. And somehow we have to control that. And in fact, what we have to do at the same time is accelerate that. We want more coming in to transform, and we want to be able to move that more quickly across into grow and into run, so we can adapt. So our adaptability is going to become absolutely key to the future. And I talked about Twitter. Douglas Adams, maybe a little bit of a contentious author. Douglas Adams is one of my favorite authors. For those of you who don't know him, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy would probably be the book that you would know him from. And Douglas Adams had this wonderful quote, and it always stuck with me. He said that every piece of technology that exists when you're born is normal. Every piece of technology that comes along before you're 30 is an opportunity that you can build a career out of. And every piece of technology that comes along after you're 30 will bring about the end of the world and must be completely rejected. which I absolutely love as a kind of a statement. And you know, I think about my own personal use of technology. You know, I do try and keep up. I do try and use new things. If I look to the next generation that are coming through, they're very, very different. You know, Twitter to them, think about it a second. The next generation that are coming through, Twitter existed when they were born. They have been born into a world where tools that we're trying to adopt and adapt and embrace to are simply a normal part of life. Twitter to them is as normal as the telephone for the rest of us. And they're starting to move away from technologies as well. I said before, I don't know how many of you have children, but I wonder how many of them actually use email. Because email is a very data-heavy technology. So I always keep that in mind. I'm always reminded, and I always think back to kind of what Douglas Adams says when I'm thinking about my own embracement, my own kind of work around IT. So if everything over time becomes a utility and a commodity, what do we do about it? How do we deal with that? How do we accept that that's happening? How do we start to look at strategies around IT that can actually make a difference? And I think the first one has to be, and this one's really tough for me, we have to build highly efficient, highly adaptable infrastructures. My background, which the guys don't know about, is that I wasn't originally in the IT industry. My background, I'm actually an aerospace engineer. I started working on the American F-111 fleet. I was the guy who did the flight repairs to the F-111s because I love to build stuff. I'm an engineer. That's what I do. That's what drives me. That's what motivates me. It's what gets me excited. I came into IT for one very simple reason, and I apologize for this. Somebody said to me, you know, you'll never make good money doing IT. It's like an aerospace company. And I came to the IT industry because I could build different stuff and get paid more for doing it. That's as brutal as it comes down to. But even I'm starting to recognize now that whilst that is what drives me, what motivates me, it doesn't have the potential to create a lot of value. I've got to start getting to a point where we're saying we can't just have people focus on building and building and building because things are moving too quickly. We have to start working out how do we put infrastructures in place that are much, much more flexible. And that's whether that's physical infrastructures or comes on to my point number 2. How do we start working with service providers? How do we make Amazon, make Google, make Microsoft? How do we make them a part of our environments such that we can use them for certain things as well? The cheapest infrastructure you'll ever own is probably the one that you don't own. So being able to use these kind of infrastructures as proving grounds, as testing grounds, is a great, great way of being able to accelerate things. Gartner say 95% of all projects fail. 95% of all projects fail. And what happens in most organizations is they come up with a whole bunch of great ideas. They pick off the 3 or 4 that they think might be the ones that could work. Then you do an investment and you make a cost analysis of how much would it cost to do these things. And then you get into the process of trying to do them. And that's expensive. It assumes you picked the right ones, because you may have had 100 ideas. It assumes you picked the 3 or 4 that you really thought were the right ones. And then it requires investment, it requires time. That's a model where these service providers, Amazon, it costs nothing to fail. If you've got 100 ideas, why do 5? Why not do 100? If the cost of failure becomes next to nothing, your opportunity to find that next great thing may suddenly come from an idea you didn't expect it to come from. And I think that, for me, is really exciting where we are at the moment, as we start to connect different people, connect different customers, connect different groups together. We have the ability to share resources, to tap into resources at a scale that we've simply never had before. And then the final one is we always have to be disruptive with technology. We have to assume or look at every new piece of technology that comes through and look at that and say, could that be a replacement for something I've been doing? Is that a new and better way of doing something differently than I've done it before? And again, I think keeping that in our minds, not staying too attached to the technology that we've got, has to be something that we consider for the future. So what does this all look like? Well, we're seeing the rise of the developer, and there's a book I would highly encourage you to read. These slides will be shared with you. I'm happy for the slides to go out. There are links in here. If you haven't read this book, The New Kingmakers, this is about how the development community are taking over the world, because that's where a lot of the innovation is coming from. And what's happening with this rise of the developers, they are bringing whole new technologies to bear, whole new kind of infrastructures. Here's the new periodic table of applications. I don't know how many of these on this list you actually recognize, but this is what these people are using. The development community are looking at tools, at technologies, at databases, at applications, some of which I've never heard of. And it's driving even more than that, just out of interest. How many of you have come across Docker so far? I would hope most of the room would put their hand up. And no one does. One person at the back, thank you very much indeed. So for the benefit of everybody else except the one person at the back, Docker is the next generation of virtualization. This is taking over the world. We all use VMware, we all use Hyper-V, and that's great for the more traditional applications that we run. But the new applications that are being developed, the new web-scale applications that are coming through are not being built on Hyper-V or VMware. They're being built on Docker. Docker is about microservices, micro-containers. It is about being able to take incredibly small parts of an operating system, just enough to be needed to run a very specific application. Mesos and Kubernetes are scheduling engines. Siri from Apple is based on Docker with Mesos. It means you can power on 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 web servers instantly because they're tiny and they consume very, very little resource. And then you can switch them off when you don't need them. And the traditional kind of virtualization applications we have today don't give you that capability. If you haven't started looking at Docker, I would highly encourage you to take one thing away from this talk, that you spend some time with it, spend some time looking into it, because it is changing the world. We're even seeing Docker support with VMware, Docker support with Hyper-V. Once those guys start to embrace these things and start to use them, you know they're getting traction. So I would encourage you to look into it. So what are some of the other trends that we need to be aware of? Well, the world is very much being driven by social mobile analytics and cloud. Every CIO is looking at each one of these as a strategy for how do they develop their businesses going forward, how do they develop their infrastructures going forward. And what these bring with them is very different requirements. We've got very different requirements from how do we deal with the data that these applications require. And what we're also seeing is, actually for the first time in quite a few years, a real shift in the media that we have available to us. We had storage, we've had disks for 40 years, it's been a wonderful run. But now we're starting to see all sorts of new technologies, phase change memory, resistant RAM. Flash has already had 5 different versions of Flash. We're seeing cloud, archive drives, shingled magnetic recording drives. There is a suite of new tools, new media technologies that we have available to us that are also going to be absolutely key in this new world as we start to look at the ramifications that social mobile analytics and cloud brings. And the people developing applications nowadays, you know, I came from a world where if you built a system, you typically built it on Oracle, or you built it on DB2, or you built it on MySQL. If I take Amazon, a simple web page in Amazon, the images probably come from Ceph, an object store. If we take the key value stores, the shopping cart, that probably comes from something like Redis. You've got MySQL, which manages the transactions. You have Neo4j, which is starting to manage some of the shopping cart experiences. You've got React, you've got MongoDB, you've got Cassandra. One single system, Amazon. And you'll notice I haven't mentioned Oracle, or DB2, or SQL. These applications aren't built on these things. Each part of that framework, each part of that page is better served by some of these new applications and newer technologies. And I will tell you, your students, the people that are working around you, the next generation coming through, this is what they're looking at. They're not looking at a lot of the traditional type systems that we've been used to, that we've had in our businesses or in our environments for the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. It's a real shift from a one-size-fits-all to this new paradigm where actually, when I'm building an application, one size doesn't fit all. And actually, to support that application, I need different types of system that will give me very different types of capabilities. And this is the shift that's happening. So what it'll mean is that this is the kind of world you're going to have to start thinking about. We've got the traditionals, the Oracles, the SQL servers. We're moving through now looking at start having the in-memory type systems. As we go further across, we get Cassandra, MongoDB, and then further across again, we get to Heroku and some of the new applications. Building flexible, efficient, adaptable storage systems or infrastructures is absolutely critical, because we are going to see people wanting to use a whole breadth, a whole gamut of new types of applications, and you can't build systems that are specific to each one. So it requires a different way of thinking. And like I mentioned before, that's the application landscape, but what does it mean in terms of the media types we have available to us? A number stuck in my head the other day, $3.5 billion. And the reason it stuck in my head is $3.5 billion is what Google spends on IT every quarter. $14 billion, not on software, simply on server, network, and disk. $14 billion. If you add that together to probably 5 or 6 of the other kind of hyperscale providers, they are buying more storage than all of the storage companies in existence put together. So who do you think is driving the roadmap? It's not us. It's not us, it's not EMC, it's not HP, it's none of us are driving the roadmap, because we don't buy as much disk as these big guys do. A Google pickup can cost Seagate their business per year. That can be the thing that affects them. One customer can be buying 500, 600, 700,000 disks at a time for their environment. And they don't need the things that we need. They're working in a different world. This is where I go back to the kind of applications they're developing. How many of you have a phone with a front-facing camera? Probably most of you. And whenever you install a new application, you read all the legal stuff, yeah? You send it off to your lawyers, get them to check it out, yeah? One of the things you'll see on some of the applications, if you have a phone with a forward-facing camera, and you accept the legal agreement on certain applications, you are agreeing to them using that camera to track your eye movements. And they are tracking your eye movements across the screen to work out where your eyes spend the most time on the screen. And then they'll use that information in order to understand what was the most important part or the most important element of that screen to you. And that is used to target you. Simple things like that. And they never delete this stuff. This is just append, 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 append. And they don't want disks to do this. They want the kind of performance, the capacities that disks offer, the characteristics, but they want them really cheap. So where we are today is we've had enterprise disks for 40 years. Different shapes, different sizes, but fundamentally they haven't really changed that significantly. The world that we're moving to is going to look like this. We're already seeing that at this low end, the enterprise drives will start to change. We're already starting to see shingled magnetic recording drives, which are effectively they're disks with disk characteristics, but they're much more like tape-type pricing. And they are coming through very, very quickly. And we're going to have to work out how we deal with them, because you can't use them the way you would use a normal disk. If you use one of these drives the way you use a normal disk, it will fry in 2 weeks. And it won't be on a warranty, because you just used it the wrong way. So we have to start thinking about that. At the high end, we've already seen MLC, CMLC, EMLC, TLC, all these different types of flash. To let you know how quickly this is moving, I think we'll have flash for about 6 more years. Flash as a technology will probably exist for about 2 more purchasing cycles, roughly. And the reason for that is that TLC, which is the current version of consumer grade, is very, very complex to build. And every time they make it a little bit bigger, the complexity of building and manufacturing it gets a little bit more. And the amount of margin that these manufacturers can make gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So we're working with a technology where there's a diminishing return for the people who manufacture it. And at the same time, we're now starting to see the emergence of tools like resistant RAM. Phase change memory is a new technology that's starting to come through, and it's real. If any of you has a BlackBerry, Someone's asking the question. Some of the BlackBerry phones are actually using persistent RAM already. The reason it's significant, Flash works at microseconds. Persistent RAM works at nanoseconds. And it has the kind of capacities that we're used to with Flash. But it gives the manufacturers the opportunity to build something that has a lot more margin in it. So be ready for a world where it isn't disks and Flash. The chances are it will be a different type of disks. It will be some Flash, and there will start to be technologies such as phase change memory, resistant RAM, STT-MRAM. There's a whole bunch of these technologies all starting to come through. And we're going to have to start getting used to how do we build for this, how do we get ready for this. And what about networks? So that's the kind of physical piece. So we've got a whole bunch of new applications. We've got a whole bunch of new media types that we can come through. And what about the networks? Well, the predictions that we currently have, we've got the roadmaps for the vendors for the next 3 or 4 years. We're looking at 400 gig or 500 gig networks. We haven't seen terabit yet. We haven't seen that actually predicted on the roadmaps. But we know that 400 gig and 500 gig is coming very, very fast. And that will be critical, because when we're starting to look at resistant RAM or phase change memory, these are server-side technologies. And we now have to have interconnects that can actually deal with this much, much faster than we ever could before. Cable lengths will matter in this world. So we'll have to have short cables linking servers together. I don't know how many of you remember the old Cray supercomputers, they were round. Yeah, we could be going back to those kind of designs, because it's only a round system that allows you to have very short cables and short interconnects. So that's going to start to happen as well. Why have I told you all of this? Well, on one of my flights very recently, I was actually coming back from Moscow, and I'll preface this. I believe there are 2 types of people in this world when it comes to travel. There are the type of people who like to talk on aeroplanes, and there are the people who don't like to talk on aeroplanes. I am the latter. And it's not me being rude, I don't deliberately do it, it's not because I'm unsociable. I find that a plane is one of those few opportunities where you can actually think about the meeting you're going to, or the meeting you're coming from. It's that kind of downtime for me to work out, what am I going to do next, or what could I do differently? I got on the plane in Moscow, and I took my seat. I only have 2 requirements on the plane, window seat and noise-cancelling headphones. As long as they have those 2 things, I'm really happy. And I sat in my window seat, economy class, and got my headphones to about here, when the guy next to me turned to me and went, hello. And there was that moment of, do I carry on and just pretend I didn't hear it, or do I stop? And so for some reason on this particular flight, I put the headphones down and I said, hello. It turns out he was a professor from Cambridge University, and he was eccentric would be an understatement. And he sat there, and when we started talking, well, I say we started talking, he then proceeded to talk at me for 45 minutes. I guess he thought he was lecturing. And now there's several ways that conversation could go. It turns out it was one of the most fascinating 45 minutes of my life, because he was a specialist in the electricity, oil and gas. He was a specialist in the energy sector. And he'd been on a tour meeting with world leaders to talk about their energy strategies for the future and how they were going to support their countries with these kind of strategies going forward. And for 45 minutes, he talked to me about, what Moscow, what Russia were going to do when it comes to oil, to gas, to renewables. It was absolutely fascinating. And then after 45 minutes, he made the biggest mistake of his life, because he stopped. He turned to me and he said, and what do you do? Now, I don't know how many of you have been asked that question. But you would think that having been in IT for 20 years, having been in my current role with my current company for 10 years, I would have a great answer to that question. And I can guarantee that I went to the same answer that you will all go to if somebody you've never met before in a bar or a restaurant says, and what do you do? And I said, I'm in IT. that was it. That was the best I could come up with. I'm in IT. And then I took it a step further, specifically data storage, because that was going to elevate the conversation to a whole new level, right? And I watched the blood drain from his face, so you realise, there was 3 more hours of this flight, it was my turn to talk. And every so often you have an epiphany, and it kind of happened there and then, after we had this long conversation. And I stopped and I thought about it for a minute, and I thought, I can't do this. Because to the moment I talked to him about data storage for the next however long, I mean, somebody came to me and I turned to him and I said, actually, we're in the same kind of business. Just didn't get that at all. And I said, no, think about it. I said, if you take gas, we store gas in large containers. It has no inherent value whatsoever. We deliver it over pipes, and when it reaches an end point, we convert it into something that has value to us. If you take water, we store water in large containers, we deliver it over pipes. Again, it has no inherent value until it reaches an end point. If you take electricity, it's just a stream of electrons, protons and electrons, that we deliver over cables that has no inherent value until it reaches an end point. And at the end point, we convert it into something that has value to us. If you look at data, I said we store data in large containers. It's a stream of zeros and ones that has no inherent value until it reaches an end point. And at the end point, it hits an application or a device where we turn it into something that has value to us. Anyway, he started talking about, that's brilliant! I even looked down at this and I was pretty really embarrassed about the whole thing. But what I did learn at that time is, it made me realize that a lot of what people kind of don't see, they consider a utility. A lot of, I don't care what's behind my iPhone. I just care that I can power up an application, I receive my emails that I can access. I don't care what sits behind it. And that is a world that we're moving towards. And I think having it in our minds that actually a lot of what we're trying to do is build these utility-type infrastructures that have to guarantee and provide a level of service to people, but frankly, they don't care what they are. It's something, don't take it too literally, but it's something that we can learn some lessons from. There are lessons we can learn from that kind of sector that give us that different way of thinking. When I carried on speaking to him, and I actually did a blog about this because this kind of fascinated me, this topic, and I'll give you a word that maybe you haven't heard before, and hopefully this will be something you can also take away. I blogged about this, and somebody sent me a note in the comment section and said, data can never be a utility. Okay? He said, because data isn't fungible. Data doesn't have fungibility. So your word of the day is fungibility. I hope that you can get into a conversation at some point during the next part of the session. But this is what he means. A glass of water is always a glass of water. Your glass of water is the same as my glass of water. So it's not just the fact that it's the same thing, it is absolutely the same thing. Whereas data is different. Your email is your email. My email is my email. And whilst it's made up of the same zeros and ones, it's the order that they're presented in is different. So it's not fungible. But even regardless of that, I think there's still a lot of stuff we can learn from the utility sector. I have, in the UK, there are 7 different companies that you can get gas and electric from. And I'm with British Gas. And so why did I make that decision? If, again, taking the utility thing slightly further, why did I make the decision to stay with British Gas? I think there are several reasons why we make a decision. Cost, because we all love a bargain. So I think we make decisions about which utility companies because of the cost. Service, possibly. The product, well, I don't get slightly better gas from British Gas. I don't get slightly nicer electricity from British Gas. It's the same stuff, delivered the same way. So it's not the product. Service. We all expect a good service. We want a good service. But it's none of those reasons why I stayed with British Gas. None of those at all. British Gas were the first company in the UK to realise they couldn't differentiate themselves on their product. The service is great when you need to use it, or when you need to speak to them. The actual product itself is consistent, it's never going to change. So they realised they couldn't differentiate themselves. They can't really compete on price, because prices fluctuate, but over time it's all very, very similar. So they tasked their IT team to come up with a way of could we do something differently because of IT that could give us an advantage. And the IT team went away and realised that with all the customer information they had, they could use that to give me insights. And they built a website. And if you go to that website, you can look at your usage compared to your usage last year. That's okay, that's interesting. But they then went further, and they then said, well, what if you could compare your usage to every other British Gas customer in your street, in your town, or across the entire country? Okay, now it's going to be interesting. And then they went further, and they said, what if you could compare your usage as 2 people living in a 4-bedroom house to other British Gas customers that are 2 people living in a 4-bedroom house in your town and across the entire country? When I did that, I realised I was using twice as much gas as my neighbour. And I never remembered. So I went and met Tony and I asked him about it and said, why do you think this is? And it turns out I cycle, so in the afternoons my hot water comes on, so I get a hot shower. And I talked to Tony about it, and he said, you don't need to. So in the afternoons, I switched off my hot water, I switched off my gas that was powering my hot water. I've never had a cold shower. I have my gas bill, and I'll be a British Gas customer for life. And it was nothing to do with their infrastructure, it was nothing to do with the products that they were delivering to me. It was simply down to the fact that they had a vast amount of information, and they were able to use that information to do something differently. And that is where I think things start to get really interesting, because it is the power of that information that we've got, the power of that information, and what we can do with that information, that I think opens up whole new possibilities and whole new opportunities for everybody. And it does mean that as we start to move to more of a utility-type world, trying to get to the parts of the infrastructure so they just run becomes important. So we've been doing a whole bunch of work with a number of different education establishments to try and say to them, you know, the data has to be there, but you shouldn't be spending lots of time managing and looking after it. You just need to build an infrastructure that can deal with it and can be adaptable to support new types of infrastructure. And these were just a couple of examples that I wanted to throw up on the screen. But companies that have stopped the focus on building to be able to put much more focus on innovation, and then creating whole new outcomes, whole new opportunities because of this. So, to summarize, I think it's always interesting to look back as a way of kind of looking forward to see where things could go. So let me give you a couple of examples. I don't know how many of you have ever read a book called The Singularity by Ray Kurzweil. Ray Kurzweil is an artificial intelligence specialist. So he makes a lot of predictions as to when will we achieve artificial intelligence. And in fact, he goes beyond that. He goes to something called artificial self-intelligence, which is where a machine becomes so aware that it can actually use logic that's more advanced than ours to make its own decisions about how it betters itself. The reason I tell you this is because in his studies, he worked out, based on looking at the technologies we've had to where we are today, what is the synaptic capacity of the technologies that we've got. Right now, this mobile phone has the synaptic capacity of a mouse brain. By 2024, this exact same device will have the synaptic capacity of the human brain. And by 2048, this same device will have the synaptic capacity of every human brain on the planet. That is the future world that we're moving towards. And while some people disagree on the date, while some people say it's not going to be 2048, it might be a couple of years either side, that is the simple reality. In our lifetimes, we are going to see devices go from what we have today to being devices that can bring the power of the world's brains together. What does that mean for us in the future? And if you don't believe me, I mean, a couple of good examples of, just making it a little bit more tangible, a little bit more physical. Look at the change we've just seen in a few years. We go back to the 2000 iMac. It was that size because it had to be. It had CRT displays. And now, even in 2010, even in 10 years, we moved from that to this form factor. Let's make it storage specific. This big blue cabinet, for those of you who haven't realized, is an IBM 3380. If you had 8 of those, you had 20 gigabytes of storage. The other image there is a micro SSD card, which has 200 gigabytes of storage. The micro SSD card is smaller than the on-off button on the IBM 3380, which I think gives some real context to it. And this is not going to stop this rapid advancement. If you really want a physical example of it, this is 10 times the capacity of this one in literally 30 years. And that is the pace that these things are moving at. So, another way to look at it, this works better for an American audience than it does in the UK. You say Jeopardy and everyone in the UK goes to do. IBM Watson 2010, IBM Watson was used, it's a massive Hadoop cluster, IBM Hadoop cluster. And it was used and put up against the 2 Jeopardy grand champions. And it beat them hands down. And as you know from Jeopardy, Jeopardy is you're given the answer and you have to work out what the question is. That is highly advanced, nuanced language processing. But the Hadoop cluster, Watson, was able to outperform the 2 Jeopardy grand champions. That Hadoop cluster at the time, you could buy it, and it would cost you about $15 million in 2010. You can now rent that by the hour for $1,000 in 2015. So what does that mean? What opportunities does that open up to us? started with a quote from Douglas Adams. I'll leave you with a quote from Douglas Adams. Don't panic. It can feel, I think when you look at these things, it can feel as if these things, you know, are kind of overwhelming, but we adapt. We always have that. I think as long as we keep our minds open to the fact that everything that will come through, we have to work at it and embrace it. And it is tough, because we have to leave certain things behind in order to be able to do things new and things differently for the future. And don't panic, because I think the opportunities that this creates, the kind of future worlds, the future outcomes, the future things that we're going to be able to do, I mean, I just think are absolutely fascinating. So I'll leave you with a thought. I'm lucky enough, as I said at the beginning of my talk, that I get to travel all over the world, I get to do presentations, and I'm my own harshest critic. So the very first thing I do when I finish a talk is I think about all the things that I should have said, I think about all the things I shouldn't have said, usually quite a few of those, but I do it because I want to get better, and I take every opportunity that I can to do something, to think of how I can do something better next time. And that's what I want to leave you with. Thank you for taking the time to be a part of this fantastic conference. But you're here, and you've taken time out of your diary, which I'm sure is busy and valuable and important. You've taken that time to be here. If you leave here and you don't do anything differently, then why did you come? You know, we can send you the slides. So my ask is simple. Think of one thing that you'll do because you were here today. And I personally don't care whether that's something personal or whether that's something you'll do differently back in business, a new conversation, a new investigation, something you'll go and do because of this event. Because I absolutely guarantee it, when you do that one thing, you'll look back on this event and you'll think that was a damn good use of my time. Thank you very much indeed. So we're going to go to a coffee break now, but outside, I'm going to be around for the next few hours. And my colleagues, Sean Lusso, Robert Daniel, and Mark Matera,